The great hall of Castle Thornridge smelled of torch smoke and old stone and the particular kind of tension that accumulates in rooms where powerful men have gathered too long without purpose. It was late afternoon in the Montana Highlands, and the amber light that poured through the tall, arched windows painted long golden rectangles across the floor, across the banners embroidered with the silver wolf of the Thornridge bloodline, across the polished boots of the councilmen, across the ancient pedestal that stood at the center of the hall like a monument to patience. And resting in that pedestal, as it had for longer than any living soul could remember, was the Moonblade. It was a sword unlike any other in the kingdom. The blade was the color of a winter sky just before dawn, somewhere between silver and pale blue, and it seemed to hold its own faint luminescence even in the darkest hours of the night. The hilt was carved from a wood no one had been able to identify, dark, dense, warm to the touch. Despite the cold stone it rested against, threaded with veins of silver, that caught the light like a river catching the moon. The inscription along the blade's base had been copied and studied by every scholar in 3 kingdoms, and none had agreed on its full translation, though all agreed on one fragment chosen by blood, not by force. For generations that inscription had meant nothing practical. It had been decorative poetic, the kind of thing that sounds magnificent and obligates no one. Until the day it did. The Alpha Council had assembled that afternoon for routine business. Trade agreements with the eastern pacts of border dispute, in the northern valleys, the appointment of 2 new garrison commanders. AlphaKing Garrett Thornridge presided over it all from the great stone throne at the hall's far end. His broad frame settled into the ancient chair with the kind of ease that spoke not of comfort but of ownership. Garrett was a man who occupied space differently than other men. Not because he demanded it, though he could and would if necessary, but because the air itself seemed to rearrange around him, as if the room understood instinctively that this was where the axis of power ran. He was 32 years old and looked like something carved from the mountains that surrounded the kingdom. Tall, a full head above most of his generals, with the kind of build that came not from vanity, but from decades of actual use. Wide shoulders, arms that had hauled siege ropes and held broken wolves upright and carried more weight than anyone in the hall would dare mention aloud. His hair was gold, the warm sun-touched gold of late summer wheat, and it fell in loose waves to just below his jaw, not quite short, not quite long, perpetually slightly disordered in a way that his stewards had long given up trying to correct. His beard was short and precise, trimmed close along the jaw, darkening slightly at the chin, and it did nothing to soften the hard line of his mouth when he was displeased, which today he was, though no one in the room would have guessed it from looking at him. Garrett Thornridge was extraordinarily good at looking perfectly calm while being profoundly unhappy. The council proceedings had dragged on for 2 hours longer than scheduled, largely because Lord Ravencroft, a man who had never in his life encountered a silence he did not feel compelled to fill, had been offering unsolicited opinions on subjects entirely outside his purview. Ravencroft was perhaps 50, silver-haired and angular, with the eyes of a man who had spent decades watching other people make mistakes and cataloging them for future use. He considered himself the most strategically intelligent person in any room he entered, and he was right often enough that no one had yet successfully argued otherwise. It was during a brief lull while Ravencroft paused to refill his goblet that one of the younger warriors, a broad-chested beta named Ronan, who was known for trying too hard and achieving too little, pushed back from the council table and walked to the pedestal with the loose, self-conscious swagger of someone who has decided to perform an act of spontaneous bravery and is hoping everyone is watching. "I've been thinking," Ronan announced to no one in particular, wrapping both hands around the Moonblade's hilt, "about this old thing." Garrett said nothing. He watched. Ronan pulled. His face reddened. The tendons in his neck stood out. His boots shifted on the stone floor for purchase, and a low grunt escaped him before he seemed to realize he was grunting and stopped abruptly, releasing the sword and stepping back as if he'd meant to do exactly that. The sword had not moved. It never moved. It had not moved for 150 years, through the tenure of 4 successive Alpha Kings, through conquests and droughts, and the rise and fall of 3 neighboring dynasties. Warriors stronger than Ronan, warriors stronger than Garrett, arguably had attempted to extract the Moonblade and walked away with nothing but bruised pride. Ravencroft, who sat at the council table's left side like a shadow that had decided to put on expensive clothes and attend meetings, allowed himself a thin smile. "Well," Ravencroft said, his voice carrying the particular blend of amusement and contempt that was his signature register, "perhaps we can put to rest once and for all the romantic notion that anyone is going to pull that sword out." He made a small theatrical gesture toward the ceiling, as if counting invisible tallies. I believe it's been attempted 412 times since the reign of King Aldrich. 412 alphas, generals, sons of kings. He paused for effect. Nothing, nothing in this world can move that sword from its stone. It is a relic, a decoration, a rather expensive piece of metalwork that makes the hall look appropriately ancient and august. Nothing more. Several of the councilmen chuckled. Ronan had returned to his seat and was studying his goblet with great intensity. Garrett said nothing. He had heard this speech before, variations of it, at least, and he had never found it as satisfying as Ravencroft seemed to. There was something about the certainty in the older lord's voice that had always vaguely irritated Garrett, though he had never been able to articulate exactly why. Perhaps it was because Garrett had grown up with the ancient stories. His father had told them, and his father's father before him, the tale of the Moonblade and the old bloodline of the Lunar Guardians, the keepers of a covenant older than the kingdom itself. Perhaps it was because he had always felt in some obscure way he would have been reluctant to admit aloud that the sword was still waiting, that it had not yet found cause to give up. He was, as it turned out, correct. At the far end of the hall, nearly invisible in the long evening shadow cast by the western wall, a young woman paused in her work. Her name was Lyra Whitmore. She had been cleaning the hall for 3 hours, which was itself unremarkable. Lyra cleaned the hall most days along with 6 or 7 other large rooms in Castle Thornridge, along with the corridors connecting them, along with the stairs leading up to them, and the antechambers attached to them. She was 17 years old, Omega ranked, and had come to work in the castle 4 years earlier, under circumstances that she rarely discussed, and that the castle's records described only as voluntary service placement, which was the polite official language for what happened when an Omega girl with no family and no pack and no resources needed a place to sleep and eat and was willing to trade labor for it. Lyra was slight, not delicate exactly, but narrow. The kind of thin that comes from a life of working hard and eating barely enough. Her skin was pale, almost luminously, so the paleness of someone who spends their days indoors in stone corridors, where the light arrives secondhand, filtered through glass and bounced off walls. Her hair was white, not the silver white of age, but a true pure white, the white of fresh snow, of moonlight on still water. She wore it pulled back into a loose knot at the base of her neck because loose hair and mop handles do not coexist comfortably. Her dress was red, the kind of red that had once been vivid and was now the memory of vivid, washed and worn to a faded, fraying approximation of the original color. It fit her well enough in the shoulders and pulled slightly at the seams in the way of garments that have been mended more times than they were meant to be. She was in every visible way the least remarkable person in the hall. She had been aware of the council meeting, of course. She had timed her cleaning specifically around the council's periphery, staying close to the walls, moving quietly, making herself small. It was a skill she had cultivated carefully over 4 years. The art of being present without being noticed, of occupying space, without claiming it, of doing her work so efficiently and so silently that the people around her stopped registering her existence at all. It was not a happy skill to have developed, but it was a useful one. She had heard Ronan's attempt on the sword. She had heard Ravencroft's pronouncement. She had continued mopping. And then something changed. It came without warning. There was no dramatic shift in the light, no sound, no external event of any kind that Lyra could identify afterward. One moment she was moving the mop in its practiced rhythm across the stone floor. And the next moment there was something, a sensation, a pull, a resonance that moved through her body from the soles of her feet to the top of her skull in the space of a single heartbeat. It was not painful. It was not frightening exactly, though it was startling enough to make her stop moving entirely and stand very still. It was like a sound, except it was not a sound. It was like a voice, except it had no words. It was like being called by your name in a crowded room. That specific, immediate, unmistakable quality of a summons that was meant for you and no one else. Lyra looked up. The Moonblade was 30 feet away, resting in its stone, gleaming faintly in the late afternoon light. She had walked past it 1,000 times. It had never done this before. She almost looked away. She told herself firmly, practically, in the sensible internal voice she used to talk herself out of things that were likely to cause problems, that she was tired and her imagination was working overtime, and she should finish the section she was on and move to the next room. The pull came again, stronger this time. Not frightening, insistent, like something very patient that has been waiting a very long time and has decided that now finally the waiting is over. Lyra set down her mop. She told herself she was not going to touch the sword. She was only going to walk a little closer, just to see, just to understand what this feeling was. The reasoning part of her mind was no longer entirely in charge. She walked across the hall. She kept her eyes down. She was aware peripherally of the council table 20 feet to her left, of the men seated around it, of the pause in their conversation. As she crossed through their field of vision, she felt their awareness of her the way you feel a change in temperature. That specific quality of attention that was also assessment, also dismissal. She heard one of the councilmen laugh. Now the servants are going to try weapon from a man she didn't recognize. One of the outer pack representatives she thought visiting for the trade discussions. His voice had the particular warmth of someone who finds the idea of her genuinely funny. Lyra did not look up. She stopped at the pedestal. The Moonblade was closer than she had ever been to it deliberately. The inscription along its base was legible from here. She had never tried to read it before. Chosen by blood, not by force. The silver veins in the hilt caught the afternoon light and scattered it in small moving patterns across the stone. The pull was very strong now. It was not frightening at all anymore. It felt in some way she could not explain and would not have tried to like coming home. She raised her right hand, her fingers closed around the hilt. The wood was warm, warmer than it should have been, warmer than the stone-cold air of the hall warranted, warm in the way of something alive. She felt the silver veins against her palm, their delicate raised texture. And then she felt something else. A kind of recognition moving up through her hand and into her arm and spreading through her chest like a chord struck in a key she had never heard before and yet somehow already knew. She pulled. The sword came free. Not with effort. Not with resistance. It slid out of the ancient stone as if it had been resting loosely in a scabbard, as if the stone had been holding it gently all this time, keeping it safe, waiting to place it in the right hands. There was a sound, not the scrape of metal on stone, but something cleaner, softer, almost musical. A release, a sigh. The hall went absolutely silent. Lyra stood holding the Moonblade. The sword was lighter than she had expected, light enough that her arm did not shake, though shock was doing things to her body that she was only beginning to register. The blade caught the light from the tall windows and reflected it back in long silver arcs across the ceiling and walls. It seemed to pulse very faintly, a rhythm, like a slow heartbeat, like the quiet breathing of something immeasurably old. She stared at it. Around her the silence stretched and stretched. Lord Ravencroft had risen to his feet. Several of the other councilmen had done the same. The outer pack representative who had laughed was no longer laughing. Ronan was staring with his mouth slightly open. Two of the guards near the main doors had taken involuntary steps forward and then stopped their hands near their weapons, but not on them, uncertain what the threat was or whether there was one. At the far end of the hall, Garrett Thornridge had not moved. He sat in his stone throne with the same easy, deliberate stillness he had maintained throughout the entire proceedings. And he watched the young woman standing at the pedestal with the Moonblade in her hands. His pale gray eyes were very still and very sharp, and full of something that was not quite surprise because he had on some level he barely acknowledged been expecting something like this for a very long time. And not quite certainty either, because certainty in this particular moment was still in the process of becoming acquainted with itself. He stood, not abruptly. Garrett never moved abruptly, which was itself a kind of power, but with deliberate, unhurried purpose. The way a mountain moves when it decides to be somewhere slightly different. Every eye in the hall followed him as he descended the 3 shallow steps from the throne's dais and walked across the floor toward the pedestal. Lyra had become aware in a distant and secondary way of the chaos assembling itself around her. The voices rising, the shuffling of boots, the particular quality of shock that a large group of people experience simultaneously and which has a sound of its own. A collective shift in breathing and posture, but most of her awareness was still occupied by the sword in her hands, by the strange resonance still moving through her, by the disoriented floating sensation of someone who has just done something they cannot explain and is waiting for the universe to explain it for them. She looked up when Garrett stopped in front of her. He was close, perhaps 4 feet away, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, which was disorienting in its own right, because Lyra was not particularly short. But Garrett was very tall, and the difference between his standing in the hall and his walking toward her was the difference between a painting and a person. She could see the precise gray of his eyes, the small vertical line between his brows that was not quite a frown the way the torchlight caught the gold of his hair. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the sword, then back at her. "What's your name?" His voice was low, direct, stripped of performance. The question was not rhetorical. It was not condescending. He genuinely wanted to know. "Lyra," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Lyra Whitmore." I work in the East Wing, cleaning mostly. She hesitated, then added, because she was not sure what else to say. I'm sorry, I don't know why I did this. I heard there was a... She stopped because none of the words she had were adequate. I'll put it back, she said. You can't put it back, Garrett said. It was not a rebuke. It was simply information stated plainly. He was still watching her with that focused, unreadable attention, and Lyra had the uncomfortable feeling of being seen very clearly by someone who was very good at seeing things. What do you mean, she asked. It's been in that stone for 150 years, Garrett said. It has never moved for anyone, not my father, not his father, not any alpha, any general, any prince from any pack who has ever tried. He paused. It moved for you. I don't believe it will go back in the same way it came out. He tilted his head slightly, a small, precise movement. I don't think that's what was meant to happen. Lyra looked down at the sword in her hands. It was still warm against her palm, still faintly, steadily luminescent. I don't understand. Neither do I yet, Garrett said, but I intend to. Behind them, the hall erupted. It was Ravencroft who moved first because Ravencroft always moved first when he perceived an opportunity to shape events before others had recovered their footing. He pushed around the edge of the council table with the focused energy of a man who has already decided what is happening and simply needs to declare it loudly enough that everyone else accepts his version. This is irregular, he said, his voice cutting through the growing noise with practiced authority. The sword's movement needs to be examined carefully before we draw any conclusions. He paused, selecting the word with visible deliberateness. It may be a malfunction of some kind, a weakening of the binding over time. Another pause, heavier, more pointed. Or something less innocent. There are forms of magic that can manipulate even very old artifacts. Forms that are, to put it plainly, forbidden. The word landed in the room exactly as Ravencroft intended it to land. Several of the councilmen exchanged glances. The guards near the door shifted. The murmuring that had been building took on a slightly different quality. Still confused, but with an edge of something else now, suspicion beginning to crystallize. Garrett did not turn around immediately. He held Ravencroft's gaze for a moment first. A long, level, entirely unimpressed moment, and then he turned. Lord Ravencroft, he said. His voice was perfectly even, perfectly calm, and underneath the calm, like a deep current under still water, something that made even Ravencroft's spine straighten involuntarily. Lyra will remain in the hall undisturbed under my direct protection. If anyone in this room has a specific substantiated concern, they may present it to me in writing by morning. He turned back to Lyra. Follow me. It was not a request, but it was not cruel either. It was the voice of a man who was accustomed to giving directions and who had, in this moment, directed something good. Lyra followed him. She carried the Moonblade in both hands because that seemed respectful. And she walked through the hall that was still half in shock and half in argument. And she kept her eyes forward and her chin level. And she told herself again in that firm internal voice that she was not going to let her hands shake. They did not shake. Garrett led her through a side door down a corridor lit with warm sconce light and into a smaller room off the main passage. A private antechamber used for meetings that the king wanted no record of. Furnished with a long table, 4 chairs, and a single window that looked east toward the forest and the far dark line of the mountains. He closed the door. The noise of the hall diminished to a muffled, distant thing, like thunder heard through walls. Lyra stood in the center of the room, still holding the sword, and Garrett stood near the window with his arms crossed and his head slightly bowed, thinking with the focused inward quality of a man working through a complex problem in real time. After a moment, he said without looking up, "Sit down, please." Lyra sat. She rested the Moonblade carefully across her knees. "Tell me about your family," Garrett said. The question surprised her. "I don't have one." Her voice was steady. "I mean, I did, but they're gone. My mother died when I was 11. I never knew my father. I had a grandmother who raised me until I was 13, but she died too. I came here the following year." She paused. "I'm sorry, that's probably not what you meant." "It is exactly what I meant," Garrett said. He looked at her now. "Your mother, do you know anything about her origins? Her family name before she married, if she married?" Lyra frowned. "Her name was Whitmore, too. We all were. I don't know much about before her. She didn't talk about it." She thought about this. There was something she used to say when I was very small, a kind of rhyme almost, about the moon and the guardians. Lyra stopped. Garrett had gone very still. "Say it," Garrett said. She hesitated. "I barely remember it. She used to say it when I was afraid of the dark. Something like, Those who carry the moon in their blood need not fear the dark, for the dark was made to show them the way home. She shook her head. I thought it was just something she made up, a comfort thing. Garrett was quiet for a long time. The evening light through the window had deepened to copper and rose, and it touched the side of his face and turned the gold of his hair to something richer, warmer. He looked in that light less like a king and more like a man. A man who had just had something confirmed that he had been half hoping for and half afraid of for a long time. There are records, he said at last, in the castle's oldest archive, documents that most people have never read because they're in an old variant of the Western tongue and require a specific kind of patience to translate. He paused. They described the founding of the Lunar Guardians, a bloodline tasked very long ago with the keeping of certain covenants between the kingdom and forces that most people today would dismiss as legend. He paused again. The Moonblade was their charge. The records say it would wait through any number of generations of dormancy for a member of that bloodline to present themselves in a time of need. Lyra looked at him. Then she looked at the sword. I clean floors, Lyra said. I know, Garrett said, and something moved in his expression. Not pity. Nothing so condescending as that, but something gentler and more complex and deeply earnest. That doesn't change what's in your blood. She sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the last of the sun was withdrawing from the mountains, leaving the sky a deep, clear blue behind it, the first stars pricking through. What happens now? Lyra asked. Now, Garrett said, uncrossing his arms and pulling one of the chairs from the table to sit across from her. The gesture somehow making the conversation feel different, more equal, more honest. We figure out what you are capable of, what you were meant for, and we make sure no one in that hall has the opportunity to interfere with that process before we understand it ourselves. Lyra looked at him steadily. Lord Ravencroft is going to cause problems, she said. Garrett almost smiled. It was a brief thing, a flicker at the corner of his mouth gone before it fully arrived. Lord Ravencroft causes problems as a matter of professional discipline. I have been managing Lord Ravencroft for 11 years. I am very good at it. He said, in the hall he implied, I heard what he implied, Garrett said. His voice lost its brief warmth and returned to something flatter, more careful. He implied you used forbidden magic. He implied it loudly in front of witnesses in the hope that the suggestion would take root before I could address it. He paused. It's a tactic he's used before. He held her gaze. I don't believe it, for what it's worth. Why not? Lara asked. It came out more directly than she intended. She was not usually this direct with anyone, let alone with the AlphaKing. But the question was genuine. She wanted to understand the reasoning, not just be reassured. Garrett seemed to appreciate this. He thought about it with real consideration before answering. Because forbidden magic leaves traces, specific ones. I would know. He paused again. The slight vertical line returned between his brows. And because the way you looked when you pulled the sword was not the look of someone doing something deliberately, it was the look of anyone being surprised by themselves. He met her eyes. I've spent a long time watching people. I trust what I saw. Lyra held his gaze. She thought about all the things she might say and chose none of them because none of them were adequate. And she sat instead in the quiet of the room while the evening deepened outside the window and the Moonblade lay warm and patient across her knees. The days that followed were strange and very full. Lyra was given new quarters. Not grand, not luxurious, but private, which was its own kind of luxury for someone who had shared a dormitory with 11 other servants for 4 years. The room had a window that faced north toward the mountains, and a proper bed with a real mattress, and a small writing desk, and a hook on the wall where the Moonblade rested each night, its faint light like a night lamp, steady and gentle. Garrett arranged for her to meet with the castle's head archivist, a small, ancient, tremendously excited scholar named Aldrich, who had spent 40 years studying the Lunar Guardian documents and had always maintained with a stubbornness that his colleagues found professionally embarrassing that the bloodline was not extinct, merely dormant. The look on Aldrich's face when he was told who Lyra was and what had happened was one of the purest, most uncomplicated joys Lyra had ever witnessed in a person. He hugged her, which startled them both, and then he apologized, and then he hugged her again. I knew it, Aldrich repeated approximately 7 times in the first hour. I always knew. But the strangest thing, the thing that settled into the rhythm of Lyra's days with the weight of something inevitable and slightly terrifying and unexpectedly good, was the training. Garrett came every morning just after dawn to the practice courtyard behind the East Wing. a graveled space enclosed by old stone walls and a climbing rosemary that had overtaken the southern wall entirely and smelled in the cool morning air like something between the sea and a forest. He came without his guards, without any of the marks of office that he wore in the council chamber, in plain working clothes, dark trousers, a loose collared shirt, boots that had been repaired rather than replaced. He looked in the pale early light not like an AlphaKing, but like a man who had chosen to be somewhere specific and was simply there. The first morning he handed her a practice sword. Lyra had never held a sword in her life, which she told him plainly. "I know," he said. "We'll start from the beginning." He was a patient teacher. She had expected him to be efficient and possibly impersonal. He was by reputation someone who valued competence and measured it ruthlessly. But in the practice yard with her, there was a quality to his attention that was different from what she had seen in the council chamber. Concentrated, yes, precise, but also genuinely interested. He watched the way she moved, the way she held the practice sword, the angle of her wrist and the set of her feet, with the focused attention of someone learning something rather than evaluating it. "Your center is here," he said on the third morning, standing behind her and placing one hand very briefly, very precisely at the small of her back. It was a clinical gesture, the kind a swordmaster uses to indicate alignment. But Lyra felt it in a way that was not quite clinical. That ran up her spine and into her shoulders, and she focused very hard on her posture for approximately 30 seconds before she trusted herself to think about anything else. "Better," Garrett said. They talked during the training sessions. At first about technique, the mechanics of grip and stance and movement, the logic of how the body works as a system, how the Moonblade with its particular weight distribution required adjustments that a standard sword did not. But gradually the conversations widened. She told him about the castle, about what it was like to move through the spaces he occupied as someone invisible. He listened to this with an attention that she could feel, a genuine present attention that was slightly painful because she was not used to it and did not quite know what to do with it. "Tell me something you've noticed," he said one morning. The practice sword lowered the session, winding down. "About the castle, something you don't think I know." She thought about it. "The servants know when you're in a bad mood before you arrive in any room," she said. "They can tell from how the guards at the east gate are standing. If the guards are at parade attention, everyone knows to stay out of the main corridors for the next hour." Garrett stared at her. Something that was absolutely a smile moved across his face this time, slow and warm and completely unguarded. "That's remarkably specific intelligence." "Servants notice patterns," Lyra said. "Apparently," Garrett said. And then he looked away because the smile had lasted slightly longer than he had intended it to, and he was not quite ready to examine what that meant. Lord Ravencroft had not been idle. In the 3 weeks following the Moonblade's movement, Ravencroft had been working with the quiet, systematic efficiency of a man who understands that outright opposition is less effective than erosion. He had not launched a frontal assault. Garrett was too formidable for frontal assaults to succeed, and Ravencroft was too intelligent to waste himself that way. Instead, he ceded. He suggested in private conversations with visiting nobles that the Moonblade's movement might be a sign of weakening rather than awakening, that the sword's power was diminishing, that its choice of an untrained Omega servant might reflect a degradation of its ancient criteria rather than their fulfillment. He suggested to the castle's older guard commanders that the AlphaKing's sudden investment in a servant girl's training represented an alarming departure from the kinds of concerns that should occupy a king's attention. He suggested to the two councilmen most susceptible to his influence that someone should formally request a magical examination of Lyra's bloodline claims. None of these suggestions individually were dangerous. Collectively, they were building something. Garrett was aware of it. He had been aware of Ravencroft's methods since long before this particular crisis, and he had people whose specific function was to listen in the places Ravencroft assumed were private. He received reports. He read them carefully. He said nothing, and continued to say nothing, and continued to come to the practice yard every morning and watch the thing Ravencroft was building and waited for the right moment to take it apart. Lyra was also aware of it. In the way that servants are aware of things, through the quality of silence in rooms she entered, through the altered posture of the guards who had been assigned to accompany her when she moved through the castle. This was Garrett's order, one she had argued against and then stopped arguing against, when Garrett looked at her with that flat, immovable patience. Through the way certain councilmen, when they passed her in corridors, made a specific slight adjustment of their gaze. She mentioned it to Garrett on a gray morning in late autumn, 4 weeks after the Moonblade incident, when the rosemary on the courtyard's south wall was damp with recent rain and the practice swords were slick in their hands. They had given up on the formal drill they'd been attempting and were sitting on the low stone bench along the north wall with cups of the strong bitter tea that Garrett's steward brought to the yard each morning without being asked. "Ravencroft is going to do something," Lyra said. Her voice was quiet, certain. "Yes," Garrett said. "Soon." "I think so." Lyra wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the gray sky above the courtyard. "Are you going to tell me what it is?" "I don't know exactly yet," Garrett said, "but I have a reasonable hypothesis." He was quiet for a moment. "He's going to try to convene a formal council hearing on your status, bloodline authentication. There are old laws that allow the council to formally challenge claimed lineages if 3 or more members request it. He has 3 members." Garrett paused. "It's not illegal. It's within the framework of the council's authority. It's designed to be public adversarial and humiliating. The goal is not to disprove anything. He likely knows he can't, but to create enough public uncertainty that whatever authority you might eventually claim is compromised before it's established." Lyra sat with this. The tea was very hot and very bitter, and she drank it anyway. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "What I want," Garrett said with a precision that suggested he had thought about this carefully, "and what I can do are slightly different questions at the moment." He turned his head to look at her. His expression in the gray morning light was very open, more open than she usually saw it. The particular openness of someone who is tired and has temporarily stopped managing their own face. "What I want is to resolve this quietly before it reaches a public forum in a way that neutralizes Ravencroft's ability to use this against you or against me. What I can do is either preempt the hearing by taking actions that render it moot, or allow the hearing to proceed and prepare you to withstand it." "What actions would render it moot?" Lyra asked. The question sat in the air between them for a moment that was slightly longer than it should have been. "There are some actions," Garrett said carefully, "that would significantly change your position in the castle hierarchy. That would make a bloodline hearing essentially pointless, because your status would be established through a different mechanism entirely." He looked back at the sky. "I'm not going to discuss those options yet." Lyra looked at the side of his face, at the clean line of his jaw. The gold of his hair darkened slightly by the morning damp. She thought about all the things that were unsaid in this conversation. The accumulation of unsaid things over 4 weeks of mornings in this courtyard. And she thought about the way he had looked at her 2 days ago when she'd made him genuinely laugh. When she demonstrated the very specific sequence of footwork he'd been drilling for days by using it to navigate around the practice sword rack without touching it. And he had looked at her with something that was absolutely and unmistakably delight. Pure and unguarded and entirely undefended. She thought about what it meant that he came here every morning without guards in plain clothes to a private courtyard to teach a servant girl how to use a sword. She thought about what it cost him in terms of political capital and council opinion to have done this for 4 weeks without wavering. She thought he is not doing this only because of the bloodline. And then she thought, don't. And then she thought, but it's already too late to not. "All right," she said, "tell me what you need me to do." Garrett looked at her, and his gray eyes were very still and very serious. And something moved in them that was acknowledgement and gratitude, and something else that neither of them was quite ready to name. "For now," he said, "I need you to keep training, keep learning from Aldrich, and be ready when the hearing comes to show them exactly what you are." He paused, "which is more than they're prepared to understand." The message arrived 3 days later, formal, sealed with the council's mark. A request in the language that was not quite a request for a bloodline authentication hearing to be convened within the week. Signed by Ravencroft and 2 allied councilmen. Garrett read it in his study. Lyra stood by the window watching the first snow of the season begin to fall over the mountains. "It's happening," she said. "Yes." "Are you ready?" Garrett looked at her, and the snow outside caught the afternoon light and turned the world briefly impossibly bright. "The question," he said quietly, "is whether they're ready for you." The hearing was called for the first day of winter. Garrett had anticipated this. Ravencroft liked symbolism, and there was something theatrically appropriate about staging a challenge to ancient bloodline claims on the solstice when the old year died and the new one waited to be born. The 3 days between the formal notice and the hearing itself were among the most intense of Lyra's life. Aldrich became a man possessed. He arrived at her quarters before dawn each morning with armfuls of documents, scrolls that smelled of dust and time, and the particular dry sweetness of very old ink. He spread them across her writing desk, across her bed, across the floor when he ran out of flat surfaces. The council will ask about lineage documentation, he said, his voice vibrating with the focused energy of a scholar who has finally found a worthy student. You need to know not just your family line, but the patterns, the markers that repeat across generations. He showed her charts, family trees that branched and twisted like the roots of ancient oaks. Names in the old script, some barely legible, some written with such care that each letter was a small work of art. Here, he said, pointing to a name 3 generations back from what he believed was her line, Morgana Whitmore. She had white hair. And here, 4 generations before her, Alara of the Moon Court. White hair and silver eyes both. He looked at Lyra with eyes that were bright and slightly damp. The dormancy suppresses the markers. You understand, your grandmother likely had darker hair. Your mother perhaps as well, or only slightly pale. But you, when the blood woke in you, it came back pure, the way it was meant to be. Lyra absorbed this. She had always thought her white hair was simply a quirk of genetics, something unusual but ultimately meaningless. To learn that it was a banner, a declaration written into her very body of something ancient and purposeful, was disorienting in a way she could not quite articulate. What else should I know? She asked. Aldrich's smile was fierce and proud. Everything, he said. We have 3 days. Let's see how much of 800 years we can fit into your head. They worked until Lyra's eyes burned and the words on the page began to swim together. Aldrich brought food that she barely tasted. He brought more tea, the same bitter kind that Garrett favored, and she drank it mechanically while memorizing the names of guardians who had died centuries before her birth. Morgana Whitmore, who had held the Moonblade during the War of the Three Peaks and had used its light to expose a traitor in the king's own guard. Alara of the Moon Court, who had called down what the records described as a rain of silver fire to break a siege that had lasted 3 months. Cassian Nightvale, a man rare among the Guardian line, who had walked into a plague-stricken village and emerged 3 days later with the sick healed and the disease banished, though the records noted he had died himself within the week from what he had absorbed. The power has a cost, Aldrich said quietly, watching her read this account. It always has. The Guardians gave themselves to the Covenant. That was the nature of it. Lyra looked up at him. Am I supposed to give myself? Aldrich's expression softened. I think, he said carefully, that the Covenant has changed. The old Guardians served alone. They had no partners, no one to share the burden. But you, he gestured vaguely toward the window in the direction of the practice courtyard, and Lyra understood what he was not quite saying. Garrett is helping me train, she said. That's all. Aldrich looked at her with the particular knowing patience of someone who has lived a very long time and has seen this exact pattern of denial before. Of course, he said, that's all. He returned to the scrolls. But Lyra sat for a moment longer thinking about the mornings in the courtyard, about the way Garrett's hand had felt on her back, warm through the thin fabric of her training shirt, about the smile he had given her when she made him laugh, about the careful way he never touched her except when teaching, the deliberate distance he maintained. The fact that he had never in 4 weeks said anything that could be interpreted as crossing the line between king and subject, between teacher and student. And yet, she returned to memorizing names and dates, but the thoughts sat with her warm and patient and impossible to completely dismiss. The training sessions continued. They had to. Aldrich was filling Lyra's mind with history and theory, but Garrett was responsible for making sure her body could do what the moment would require. On the morning 2 days before the hearing, he arrived in the courtyard with a different practice sword, heavier than the one she had been using, closer to the Moonblade's actual weight. We need to calibrate, he said simply and handed it to her. The sessions had grown more intense over the past weeks. In the beginning, Garrett had moved slowly, giving her time to think through each response, each parry and strike. Now he moved at full speed and Lyra had to react on instinct or fail. She failed often, but less often than she had a week ago. And when she succeeded, when her blade met his at precisely the right angle to deflect, rather than absorb the force, when she read his intention in the shift of his weight and moved before he completed the strike, something fierce and bright moved through her. It was not quite pride. It was more fundamental than that. It was the feeling of a body learning what it was built to do. Again, Garrett said when she blocked his overhead strike and twisted away from his follow-up. They went again. And again. By the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern wall, Lyra's shirt was soaked through and her arms were shaking. But she had bested him in 2 exchanges out of 7, and the look on Garriett's face when she disarmed him the second time was worth every aching muscle. You're learning faster than anyone I've trained, he said. They were sitting on the bench, breathing hard, the practiced swords laid across their knees. The morning air was cold enough that their breath steamed. I have good motivation, Lyra said. What's that, not looking like a fraud in front of the entire council in 2 days? Garrett turned to look at her. His expression was serious. You are not a fraud, Lyra, and you will not look like one. I've seen you with the Moonblade. I've seen what it does in your hands. The council will see it too. She wanted to believe him, but there was a knot of anxiety sitting in her chest that had been growing tighter with each passing day. What if they don't care? She asked quietly. What if Ravencroft is right, and it doesn't matter what I can do or what the sword does? What if they've already decided? Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and absolutely certain. Then I will make them care. The weight of that statement, the implicit promise in it, settled over her like a cloak. Why? The question came out before she could stop it. Why does this matter so much to you? Garrett looked at her, and for a moment the careful control he maintained over his expression slipped just slightly. She saw something underneath it, something complex and unguarded and deeply fiercely protective. Because you pulled a sword from stone that has not moved in 150 years, he said. Because you carry a bloodline that the kingdom thought was dead, and that bloodline is the only thing standing between us and forgetting what we were built to be. He paused. And because I have spent 11 years as king watching men like Ravencroft try to control things they don't understand out of fear, and I am tired of letting fear win. Lyra held his gaze. The courtyard was very quiet. The rosemary on the south wall moved slightly in the wind, releasing its scent into the cold morning air. Thank you, she said. It was inadequate, but it was all she had. Garrett's expression softened. Just slightly. Just enough. Don't thank me yet, he said. Wait until after the hearing. The night before the hearing, Lyra could not sleep. She lay in her bed watching the Moonblade's faint glow on the wall and tried to calm her mind, but it would not be calmed. It kept circling back to the same questions, the same fears. What if she froze? What if the sword did not respond to her in front of the council the way it had in the empty hall? What if Ravencroft's accusations took root and no amount of truth could pull them out? What if Garrett's faith in her was misplaced? At some point past midnight, she gave up on sleep entirely. She rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the window. The castle was quiet at this hour. The kind of deep quiet that only comes in the small hours when even the guards on night watch have settled into their rhythms and the building itself seems to be resting. The mountains were visible in the moonlight, silver and black, and impossibly vast. She thought about her mother, about the rhyme she used to say. Those who carry the moon in their blood need not fear the dark. Her mother had known something, had carried something, and had never told Lyra what it meant, perhaps because she herself did not fully understand it. Perhaps because the blood had been dormant in her sleeping, waiting for the right generation to wake. Lyra pressed her palm against the cold glass and wished desperately and uselessly that her mother were here, that she could ask her what to do, how to be what the sword seemed to think she was. A soft knock at the door startled her. For a moment, she considered not answering. It was past midnight, and she was in her nightclothes, and no one should be seeking her at this hour. But something made her walk to the door and open it. Garrett stood in the corridor. He was not in sleeping clothes. He was fully dressed, though, without the formal layers he wore for council meetings. Just a simple shirt and trousers. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. He looked at her, and his expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the concern underneath it. You should be sleeping, he said. So should you. I don't sleep well before important events. Old habit. Lyra stepped back from the doorway. Do you want to come in? It was probably improper. It was definitely improper. But she found she did not care, and apparently neither did he, because he stepped inside without hesitation and she closed the door behind him. They stood for a moment in the small room with the Moonblade glowing softly on the wall and the moonlight streaming through the window. I'm afraid, Lyra said. She had not meant to say it, but once the words started, they would not stop. I'm afraid I'll fail, that I won't be able to do what you think I can do, that the sword made a mistake. Garrett looked at her steadily. The sword did not make a mistake. You don't know that. Yes, I do. He moved closer and the moonlight caught the gold of his hair and made it silver. Do you know how many people have tried to pull that sword, Lyra? 412, documented, witnessed, 412 alphas and betas and warriors who were stronger than you, more trained than you, more convinced of their own worthiness. He paused, and the sword did not move, not once, not even slightly. For 150 years it sat in that stone waiting. And then you walked across a hall with a mop in your hands and it called to you. His voice was low and absolutely certain. That was not a mistake. That was recognition. Lyra felt something tight in her chest begin to ease. Just slightly. What if they don't believe it? Then they're fools, Garrett said simply. And I have made a career of managing fools. Yink, despite everything, despite the fear and the anxiety and the weight of what was coming, Lyra felt her mouth curve into a small smile. Garrett saw it and his own expression softened. That's better, he said quietly. They stood in the moonlight and the moment stretched between them. Something was happening, something neither of them had named, but both of them felt. Garrett cleared his throat slightly. I should go, he said. You need rest. Will you stay? The words came out before Lyra could think better of them. Just for a while. I don't want to be alone right now. Garrett looked at her, and she saw him make a decision. All right. He moved to the chair by the window and sat. Lyra returned to her bed, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the mountains and the stars. At some point, without quite meaning to, Lyra's eyes closed. And when she woke again, it was dawn, and Garrett was gone. But there was a note on the chair where he had sat written in his precise hand. You are ready. Trust yourself the way the sword trusts you. She folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. And then she dressed in the ceremonial guardian whites that Aldrich had found for her in the archives. And she strapped the Moonblade to her hip and she walked to the Great Hall to face her judgment. The Great Hall was packed. Word had spread as Ravencroft had intended it to. This was not a quiet administrative hearing. This was theater. The wooden galleries along the walls were full of minor nobility, off-duty soldiers, castle staff who had found excuses to be present. The entire council was assembled at their long table, and Ravencroft sat at its center like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. Garrett was on the throne at the far end, watching everything with that patient, dangerous stillness that Lyra had learned meant he was 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. Lyra walked down the center of the hall. The Moonblade hung at her hip, and with each step it seemed to pulse faintly, as if responding to her heartbeat. The ceremonial whites fit her perfectly, the silver stitching catching the morning light that poured through the tall windows. The crowd parted for her. And in their faces she saw curiosity, skepticism, hostility, wonder. All of it mixed together in a complex stew of human reaction to something that did not fit their understanding of how the world worked. She reached the center of the hall and stopped. The pedestal where the Moonblade had rested for 150 years stood empty beside her, a silent witness. Ravencroft rose. We are convened, he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall, to examine the claims made by one Lyra Whitmore, Omega rank castle servant, regarding alleged descent from the lunar guardian bloodline. He let the words alleged sit in the air for a moment. The council has the right under the Charter of Thornridge, Article 14, to request formal examination of any bloodline claim that may affect the distribution of rights titles or sacred artifacts within the kingdom. Garrett's voice cut across the hall, calm and clear. The council does have that right. I acknowledge it. Ravencroft blinked. He had clearly expected resistance, and the easy concession wrong-footed him slightly. Then we proceed, he said, recovering quickly. What followed was 2 hours of examination that felt to Lyra like being slowly taken apart and reassembled under hostile scrutiny. Ravencroft began with lineage questions, documentation of her family line, proof of connection to the known guardian families. Lyra answered each question with the precision Aldrich had drilled into her. She cited sources. She named guardians from 3, 4, 5 generations back. She described the markers, white hair, silver eyes, the specific pattern of abilities that manifested across centuries. Aldrich sat in the gallery with a stack of scrolls ready to corroborate every claim she made. And each time Ravencroft looked to him for confirmation, Aldrich would nod and cite chapter and verse from the archives. The councilman's frustration was beginning to show. He shifted tactics. Let us discuss the sword itself, Ravencroft said. You claim it responded to your bloodline, but the Moonblade has been studied by scholars for generations. There is no mechanism, no magical principle we understand that would cause an inanimate object to distinguish between bloodlines. That's because you've been studying it as an inanimate object, Lyra said. The response came out sharper than she intended, but she did not take it back. The Moonblade is not a tool, she continued. It's a covenant keeper. It was forged with a purpose, and that purpose was to wait for the bloodline that made it to return. Convenient theology, Ravencroft said with a thin smile. Impossible to disprove because it relies on faith rather than evidence. Would you like evidence? The question hung in the air. Lyra had not planned to say it, but she felt the Moonblade warm against her hip, and she understood suddenly what it was offering. Ravencroft's smile widened slightly. He thought he had her. "By all means," he said, "demonstrate this covenant." Lyra drew the Moonblade. The sound of it leaving the scabbard was clean and bright, and the blade caught the morning light and threw it back in silver arcs across the ceiling. The hall went quiet. She held the sword in both hands and closed her eyes. She thought about what Aldrich had taught her, about the guardian abilities, the way the bloodline could perceive truth, could see through deception, could call light from darkness. She had been practicing this in private in her room late at night when no one was watching. Small things, making the blade glow brighter, creating tiny barriers of light, but she had never tried anything this public, this deliberate. She reached for the feeling she had experienced when she first pulled the sword, that sense of recognition, of coming home, and the Moonblade responded. Light bloomed along the blade, not reflected light, not the passive glow it normally carried, but active, bright, silver-white radiance that pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat. The hall gasped collectively. Lyra opened her eyes. The light was almost painful to look at directly, but she could feel it responding to her will, her intention. "The Moonblade recognizes its bloodline," she said quietly, "not through mechanisms you can study or understand, through covenant, through purpose." She let the light fade slowly until the blade returned to its normal, faint luminescence. The silence in the hall was absolute. Ravencroft recovered first. He had to. This was his theater, his moment. "An impressive display," he said. "But light tricks prove nothing about bloodline. There are magics that can create such effects. Forbidden magics designed to deceive." The accusation landed exactly as he intended it to. Several councilmen leaned forward. The crowd murmured. Lyra felt anger flash through her, hot and immediate. But before she could respond, Garrett stood. The hall fell silent again. He descended from the throne and walked toward the center of the hall, toward Lyra. His boots were loud on the stone floor, and every eye in the room followed him. He stopped beside her. "Lord Ravencroft," he said, his voice carrying that particular quality of calm that meant something dangerous was about to happen. "You have made a serious accusation. Forbidden magic. Deception, fraud." Ravencroft inclined his head slightly. "I merely suggest the possibility, Your Majesty, in the interest of thoroughness." "Then let us be thorough," Garrett said. He turned to address the hall. "The Moonblade has been in that pedestal for 150 years. 412 documented attempts to remove it. All failed. Every alpha, every general, every warrior who tried." He gestured to the empty pedestal. "Lord Ravencroft himself has declared in this very hall that nothing in this world could move that sword." He said it with absolute certainty, with the conviction of a man stating an obvious and undeniable fact. He paused. And then Lyra Whitmore, a servant girl with no training, no magical education, no resources beyond her own blood, walked across this floor and pulled the sword free. Garrett's voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. "Now Lord Ravencroft suggests she used forbidden magic. Magic sophisticated enough to fool 150 years of wards and bindings. Magic powerful enough to override whatever force kept that sword in stone through centuries." He looked directly at Ravencroft. "I have a simpler explanation. The sword recognized her, because she carries the blood it was waiting for. And Lord Ravencroft cannot accept this, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because it terrifies him." Ravencroft's face went very still. "I am not afraid of a servant girl, Your Majesty." "No," Garrett agreed. "You're afraid of what she represents. Power that exists outside your control, outside your understanding. A covenant older than this kingdom that doesn't require your permission to function." He turned to the council. "And that fear has led you to weaponize this hearing, to turn a legitimate process of verification into a public humiliation designed not to discover truth, but to destroy it before it can threaten your position." The hall was absolutely silent. Garrett's voice dropped lower, harder. "But I will not allow it." He looked at Lyra, and his expression softened just slightly. "Lyra Whitmore carries the Lunar Guardian bloodline. The evidence is documented. The sword's response is witnessed. Her abilities are demonstrated. And this hearing has produced exactly zero evidence to contradict any of that." He turned back to Ravencroft. "What it has produced is a pattern of accusation without substance, of innuendo designed to create doubt where none should exist. And I will not permit this council to be used as a weapon against someone who has committed no wrong." Ravencroft opened his mouth to respond. "I'm not finished," Garrett said. The words were quiet, flat, absolute. Ravencroft closed his mouth. "You will remain on this council. Garrett continued. Because the process of removal requires deliberation, and this is not the moment for it. But your tenure as head counselor is ended, effective immediately. He let that sink in. If I see another action from any member of this council designed to undermine, rather than serve the kingdom's interests, that deliberation will happen very quickly. He looked at Lyra. This hearing is concluded. Lyra Whitmore's claim is validated. Her status as guardian heir is recognized by this council and by the crown. He raised his voice to address the entire hall. Let no one in this kingdom question it again. The crowd erupted, not in protest, in something else. Something that sounded almost like approval. Lyra stood in the center of it all. She had the Moonblade still in her hands and felt the world shift beneath her feet. Everything had changed. She was no longer a servant who had pulled a sword. She was a guardian recognized and validated and protected by the crown itself. And when she met Garrett's eyes across the small distance that separated them, she saw in his expression something that made her heart do complicated things inside her chest. Pride, certainty, and underneath it all, something warmer and more dangerous that neither of them had yet acknowledged aloud. The hall slowly emptied. Councilmen filed out, some looking satisfied, others disgruntled. Ravencroft left without a word, his face carefully blank. The crowd dispersed, their excited conversations echoing through the corridors. Eventually, only Lyra and Garrett remained. They stood in the golden afternoon light, the Moonblade still glowing faintly between them. Thank you, Lyra said. You did the work, Garrett replied. I just made sure they couldn't ignore it. He smiled slightly, that rare, genuine expression that she had learned to treasure. You were magnificent in there. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks. You were terrifying. In a good way. In the best possible way. When you stood up, it was like watching a storm that was on my side. Garrett's smile widened just slightly. And they stood together in the quiet hall in the fading light, and the distance between them felt both impossibly vast and vanishingly small. And neither of them moved to close it. Not yet, but soon. The weeks that followed the hearing were strange and full in ways Lyra had not anticipated. Her status in the castle changed overnight. Servants who had shared her dormitory for 4 years now curtsied when she passed. Guards snapped to attention. Minor nobles visiting the court requested introductions, their eyes bright with curiosity and calculation. She was no longer invisible. It was in its own way more isolating than poverty had been. But there were compensations. The training continued and, if anything, intensified. Garrett pushed her harder, now moved faster, demanded precision that bordered on perfection. And Lyra rose to meet it because she understood that this was no longer just about proving herself worthy of the Moonblade. Something was coming. She could feel it in the way Garrett's jaw tightened when he read certain dispatches, in the increased patrols along the southern border, in the quietly urgent conversations between generals that stopped when she entered rooms. It was Master Aldrich who finally told her what the council already knew. He came to her quarters on a cold evening in midwinter, his face grave in a way she had never seen it. He carried a map, old and detailed, showing the territories south of the Montana Highlands. Cade Blackthorne, he said without preamble, spreading the map across her desk. Pack Lord of the Wyoming Territories. He's been testing the borders. Testing how Aldrich's finger traced a line of marks he had made in red ink. 6 villages, burned in the last month. 34 dead. Livestock stolen, grain stores destroyed. The attacks are coordinated, professional, and each one pushes deeper into Thornridge territory. Lyra stared at the map, at the red marks that represented lives, ended, homes destroyed. What does he want? That, Aldrich said quietly, is what no one can agree on. The demands he's sent are contradictory. Territory expansion in some messages, trade priority in others. A seat on the Continental Council in the most recent one. He looked at her. Garrett thinks the demands are smoke, that Cade wants something else, something he doesn't know how to ask for directly. And Garrett is going to ride south in 3 days, Aldrich finished, with a force of 120 men, to either negotiate a settlement or end the threat. Lyra's hands had gone very still on the desk. Is he taking me? Aldrich's expression shifted to something gentler. He hasn't decided. Or rather, he's decided 6 different ways and keeps changing his mind. He wants your perception there, your ability to read truth through deception. But he's also, the old scholar stopped himself, he's also afraid of putting you in danger. Lyra finished quietly. Aldrich nodded. That evening, Lyra found Garrett in his study. It was late past midnight, and she knew he would be there because he was always there at this hour when something weighed on him. The room was warm from the fire, and papers covered every surface. maps and reports and supply manifests. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the tiredness in his face, the weight of decisions made and yet to be made. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." It had become something of a ritual between them, this exchange, a recognition of shared sleeplessness, shared concern. Lyra moved to the desk and looked at the map spread across it. The same one Aldrich had shown on her, but with additional marks in Garrett's precise hand. Troop positions, supply routes, potential ambush points. "I want to come with you," she said. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "I know." "Then why haven't you asked me?" He looked at her then, and his gray eyes were full of something complex and difficult. "Because if something happened to you, if you were hurt or killed because I brought you into a war zone, I would never forgive myself." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that Garrett rarely allowed himself to be. Lyra moved closer to the desk, close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, the one he'd told her came from a training accident when he was 16. "You need me there," she said quietly. "Not just my abilities. You need someone who can read the situation without the political filters that your generals bring to everything." "I know that too. And then let me come." Garrett closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression. A decision made. "If you come," he said, "you follow my commands in the field, without question, without hesitation. Can you do that?" "Yes. Even if I order you to retreat, to leave me behind if necessary." Lyra hesitated. That was harder, but she understood what he was asking, what he needed to hear. "Yes," Garrett nodded slowly. "Then you ride with us. But we train differently for the next 3 days. Combat scenarios, real threat simulations. The practice yard games are over." He looked at her steadily. "If you're coming into this, you need to be ready to kill. Can you do that?" Lyra thought about the villages on the map, the 34 dead, the families burned out of their homes. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." The next 3 days were brutal. Garrett brought in his best soldiers to train with her. Men who had fought in actual battles, who knew how combat felt when lives were on the line. They did not hold back, and Lyra collected bruises like badges of honor. She learned to fight when tired, when scared, when multiple opponents came at her from different angles. She learned to use the Moonblade's abilities tactically. The light barriers could block weapons, but drained her energy quickly. She had perhaps 3 full barriers in her before exhaustion would take her. She needed to choose when to use them carefully. The truth sense was more subtle, but potentially more valuable. In the chaos of combat, being able to read an opponent's intention a half-second before they moved could mean the difference between life and death. On the second day, Garrett himself came at her with full force. No pulling strikes, no teacher's patience, just the raw skill of a man who had been fighting since he was old enough to hold a sword. She held her own for perhaps 2 minutes before he disarmed her and held his practiced blade to her throat. "You're dead," he said flatly. Lyra was breathing hard sweat, stinging her eyes. "Again," she said. They went again, and again. By the 5th attempt, she managed to get her blade against his ribs before he countered. "Better," Garrett said, "but still dead. In a real fight, that counter would have opened your throat." He showed her where she had left herself exposed. The angle of her guard that created the opening. They drilled the correction until her arms shook. On the 3rd day, they worked on the most important skill of all, staying alive. "Your job is not to be a hero," Garrett told her as they stood in the courtyard in the pre-dawn darkness. "Your job is to use your abilities, survive, and get back to the castle. In that order." He made her practice retreating, made her run through scenarios where the objective was not victory, but escape. "If it goes badly," he said, "if we're overrun or ambushed, you run. You don't stay to fight. You don't try to save anyone. You get on a horse and you ride north until you reach Thornridge Lands." "Understood," Lyra wanted to argue, but she saw the absolute seriousness in his face and knew this was not negotiable. "Understood." That evening, the night before they were to ride south, Garrett found her on the East Tower platform. She had discovered it weeks ago with the bronze key he had given her, and it had become her private refuge. A place to think, to breathe, to watch the mountains, and feel small in a way that was oddly comforting. He climbed the stairs without announcing himself, and she heard him coming in time to compose herself, to hide the nervousness that had been building all day. They stood together at the railing, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The mountains were sharp black silhouettes against bands of amber and rose. "Are you afraid?" Garrett asked. "Yes." "Good. Fear keeps you careful." He was quiet for a moment, and then, "I'm afraid too." Lyra turned to look at him. Garrett Thornridge, who had led armies and faced down enemies and ruled a kingdom for 11 years, was admitting fear. Of what? Of losing you before I've had the chance to. He stopped himself. The unfinished sentence hung between them like a held breath. Lyra's heart was doing complicated things in her chest. They had been circling this for weeks, months really, since the first morning in the practice yard. All the unsaid things, all the careful distance maintained. Before you've had the chance to what? She asked quietly. Garrett turned to face her fully. The dying light caught the gold of his hair and made it burn. To tell you that what I feel for you stopped being appropriate weeks ago, that I think about you constantly, that every morning in that courtyard has been the best part of my day, because you're there. He paused and his voice dropped lower. That I am completely and possibly foolishly in love with you, and I have been fighting it because I'm the king and you were a servant, and there are protocols and politics and 1,000 reasons why this is complicated. Lyra felt as if all the air had left her lungs. But tomorrow we ride into something dangerous, Garrett continued, and I might not come back, or you might not, and I refuse to die without you knowing that you are the bravest, most extraordinary person I have ever met, and that if we survive this, I am going to ask you to be my wife. He stopped, looked at her, waited. Lyra's mind was racing. Her heart was racing. Everything was racing. I love you too, she said. The words came out slightly breathless, but absolutely certain. I have for weeks, maybe since you first smiled at me in the courtyard, maybe since you defended me in the hearing. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it did. She stepped closer to him. And yes, I'll marry you if we survive this. Yes. Garrett's expression transformed. Joy, pure and uncomplicated, moved across his face. He reached for her, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted his size and strength. We're going to survive this, he said, because I have far too much to live for now. And then he kissed her. It was not their first kiss. That had been weeks ago, tentative and questioning. This was different. This was certainty and promise, and the desperate, fierce hope of two people who had found something worth fighting for. When they finally pulled apart, the stars were out above them, cold and bright and infinite. Tomorrow, Garrett said, we ride and we end this, and then we come home and plan a wedding. Lyra smiled against his shoulder. I'm holding you to that. They rode south at dawn with a company of 120 soldiers. Garrett led from the front, mounted on a massive gray warhorse that seemed bred specifically for his size. Lyra rode beside him on a smaller bay mare, the Moonblade strapped to her hip. The journey took 2 weeks. South through the mountain passes, down into the rolling hills of the border territories, and finally to the contested lands where Cade Blackthorn's forces had been conducting their raids. They made camp in a defensible valley with scouts posted on the high ground and a clear retreat route north. Garrett was taking no chances. On the third day in the south, a messenger arrived under flag of truce. Cade Blackthorn was willing to meet. Neutral ground. Each side could bring 4 advisors. Garrett chose his most trusted general, his chief diplomat, and his master of intelligence. And Lyra. The meeting took place in an abandoned way station halfway between their respective camps. It was a single large room with a table, chairs, and windows that let in the cold winter light. Cade Blackthorn arrived precisely on time. He was younger than Lyra had expected. Perhaps 29, with dark hair and sharp features and eyes that calculated constantly. He moved with the controlled energy of someone who had been underestimated his entire life and had learned to use it as a weapon. He brought 4 advisors. 3 were exactly what Lyra expected, hard-faced military men who looked like they ate nails for breakfast. The 4th was different. Older, perhaps 40, with pale eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. Something about him made Lyra's skin crawl immediately. They sat, Cade at one end of the table, Garrett at the other. Lyra positioned herself slightly behind Garrett's right shoulder, where she could see everyone's faces. King Thornridge, Cade said. His voice was smooth, educated. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Lord Blackthorn, Garrett replied evenly. I'm here to understand what you want and determine if we can reach an accord without further bloodshed. Cade smiled. Direct. I appreciate that. He leaned back in his chair. What I want is simple. Recognition. I control the Wyoming territories. I've held them for 3 years against challenges from inside and out. I've built something that deserves to be treated as an equal power, not a subordinate pack. You want a seat on the Continental Council, Garrett said. Among other things, territory adjustments, trade priority on the eastern routes, formal alliance status. Garrett's expression remained neutral, but Lyra could feel his mind working. analyzing, calculating. Those are significant demands, Garrett said. What are you offering in return? Peace, Cade said simply. An end to the raids, stable borders, a reliable ally in the south. It sounded reasonable, almost too reasonable. Lyra focused her attention on Cade, letting her guardian sense reach out. The truth sight that Aldrich had helped her develop, and she saw it. Around Cade, when he spoke of recognition and alliance, there was a glow, faint but distinct. The truth light that appeared around people speaking from genuine belief. But when he mentioned the territory demands and trade priority, nothing. Just neutral gray. He didn't actually care about those things. They were negotiating positions, nothing more. What he genuinely wanted was to be treated as an equal, to be seen. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was his fourth advisor, the pale-eyed man who had smiled without warmth. When that man looked at Garrett, Lyra saw something else, a flicker of shadow. The same shadow that appeared around Lyra's during her trial. But this was darker, more active, hostile intent. She shifted slightly, her hand moving to rest on the Moonblade's hilt. The movement was subtle, but Garrett noticed. She saw his shoulders tense fractionally. Those terms are negotiable, Garrett was saying, but I need assurance that the raids stop immediately before we formalize anything. Of course, Cade said. His fourth advisor leaned forward and spoke for the first time. With respect, Lord Blackthorn, we should press our advantage. The raids have been effective. We shouldn't give up that leverage for vague promises. His name was Vex Lyra, remembered from the intelligence reports, Cade's chief military strategist. Cade frowned slightly. Vex, we discussed this. The goal is alliance, not conquest. The goal should be whatever serves our interests best, Vex said smoothly. And I question whether King Thornridge is negotiating in good faith. Garrett's expression didn't change, but Lyra felt the temperature in the room drop. I'm negotiating in the only faith that matters, Garrett said quietly. The belief that peace serves both our peoples better than war. Vex smiled. Pretty words, but words are cheap. And his hand moved. Lyra saw it before anyone else, saw the shadow around him intensify, saw his intention crystallize into action. His hand went to his belt, to a concealed blade, and he lunged across the table at Garrett. Lyra moved on pure instinct. The Moonblade was in her hand before she consciously decided to draw it. She stepped between Vex and Garrett, and the blade flared with silver light. The light barrier exploded outward. It was the strongest she had ever created. A dome of silver radiance that caught Vex mid-leap and threw him backward like he'd hit a stone wall. He crashed into the far wall of the way station and crumpled to the floor unconscious. For a moment, no one moved. Then Cade's three military advisors reached for their weapons. Garrett's people did the same. The room filled with the sound of steel being drawn. Stop! Cade's voice cracked like a whip. Everyone froze. Cade was staring at Vex's unconscious form. Then at Lyra, who still stood between him and Garrett, the Moonblade blazing in her hands. He tried to assassinate King Thornridge, Lyra said clearly. I felt his intent before he moved. He was going to kill the king and blame it on you. Cade's face had gone very still, very pale. Lyra can sense truth and deception, Garrett said quietly, his hand on her shoulder, both steadying and grateful. It's a guardian ability. She knew what he was going to do before he did it. Cade looked at his unconscious advisor, then at his military men. Did any of you know about this? All three shook their heads, and Lyra's truth sense confirmed they were being honest. Cade closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were full of cold fury. Arrest him, he told his men. When he wakes, he'll face trial for treason. He looked at Lyra. You saved King Thornridge's life, and possibly mine. If that assassination had succeeded, your people would have blamed me. We would have had war. He turned to Garrett. I didn't order this. I swear it on my pack's honor. Lyra's truth sense showed the glow of absolute honesty. He's telling the truth, she said quietly. Garrett nodded. I believe you, Lord Blackthorn. The tension in the room eased slightly. Weapons were lowered, though not sheathed. Cade sat back down heavily. Vex has been pushing for escalation for months. I thought he was just being aggressive. I didn't realize he was trying to engineer a war. Why would he want war? Garrett asked. Chaos, Cade said bitterly. In chaos, ambitious men can seize power. If I died in a war with you, Vex would have been positioned to take control of my territories. He looked at Garrett. You offered alliance. I accept. Not just the terms we discussed. Full alliance. I'll help you hunt down anyone Vex has been working with. This ends here. Garrett studied him for a long moment. Then he stood and extended his hand across the table. Alliance it is. Cade stood and took his hand. They shook, and something that had been building toward catastrophe shifted instead toward peace. But peace, as it turned out, was not going to come without one more fight. Vex had a brother, Victor, and Victor did not care about politics or strategy or the niceties of alliance. He cared about revenge. 3 days after the meeting, Victor led 200 of Vex's loyalists in an attack on Garrett's camp. They came at dawn when the light was still gray and uncertain. Lyra woke to the sound of horns and shouting, and she grabbed the Moonblade and ran outside to find chaos. The camp was under assault from 3 sides. Victor's forces were outnumbered, but desperate, and desperation made them fierce. Garrett was already in the thick of it, his sword red with blood, shouting orders to his men. The battle was concentrated in the valley's narrow entrance, where Victor was trying to force through. Lyra ran toward the fighting, her heart hammering. She reached Garrett's position just as a group of enemy soldiers broke through the line. They came at him from 2 sides, and he was engaged with a third. Lyra raised the Moonblade, and she did something she had never attempted before. She created a dome, not a small barrier, a full protective sphere of light centered on Garrett, extending outward to cover 50 feet in all directions. Every Allied soldier within that radius was suddenly protected. Enemy weapons hit the dome and shattered. Arrows disintegrated into silver sparks. But the cost was immediate and overwhelming. Lyra felt the energy drain out of her like water through a broken dam. Her vision swam. Her legs wobbled. But she held it. She held the dome. The first minute was manageable. The light flowed from her like water from a spring, steady and strong. She could feel every soldier inside the radius could sense their relief, their renewed courage. The second minute, the flow became a river. Faster, deeper. The Moonblade warm in her hands, then hot. By the third minute, her vision began to narrow. The edges of the world turned gray. She focused on Garrett's voice, barking orders, rallying the men. Fourth minute, her legs shook. Sweat poured down her face despite the winter cold. An arrow struck the dome directly above her head and exploded into silver sparks. The impact traveled through the barrier, through the sword, into her bones. Fifth minute, she tasted copper. Blood from her nose, she realized distantly. The dome flickered once. She wrenched it back into stability through sheer will. Sixth minute, the world was very small now, just her. The sword, the dome, the men inside it who were still alive because she was still standing. Seventh minute, her knees buckled. She locked them, stood. The Moonblade was screaming in her hands, a high keening only she could hear. Almost it seemed to say, hold, almost. Eighth minute, Garrett's voice, archers ready on my mark now. 20 arrows flew. 20 enemy soldiers fell. The tide had turned. Lyra let the dome collapse. The exhaustion hit her like a physical blow, and she fell to her knees. The world tilted and grayed, and then Victor himself appeared. But through the haze, she saw Garrett meet Victor's charge. They fought in the center of the battlefield, and it was brutal and desperate and far too close. Victor was stronger, but Garrett was faster, more skilled, more controlled. They circled each other, exchanged strikes that rang like hammer on anvil, and then Garrett found his opening. A slight overextension on Victor's part, a moment where his guard was too wide. Garrett's blade slipped through and found Victor's throat. It was a clean kill, precise and professional. Victor fell, and with him, the fight went out of his followers. They broke, scattered, some surrendered. Others fled into the hills. The battle was over. Garrett turned, scanning the battlefield frantically. He found Lyra on her knees, the Moonblade still in her hands, her face pale and drawn. He ran to her. I'm all right, she said before he could ask. Just drained. The dome was bigger than I've ever done. Garrett knelt beside her and pulled her into his arms. You saved 50 men, he said roughly. You saved me. We're even then, Lyra said, leaning heavily against him. You've saved me more times than I can count. He kissed the top of her head. Let's go home, he said. Let's end this and go home. They returned to Castle Thornridge 3 weeks later, victorious and exhausted and changed. Cade Blackthorn came with them to formalize the alliance and swear his oaths before the council. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall, in the same space where Lyra had pulled the sword, where she had been tried and validated. And this time the hall was full of celebration rather than suspicion. Cade knelt before Garrett and swore loyalty. Trade agreements were signed, borders were formalized, and when it was done, when the political necessities were complete, Garrett stood and addressed the hall. There is one more matter, he said. He turned to Lyra, who stood beside the throne in her guardian whites, the Moonblade at her hip. Lyra Whitmore, guardian of the Moonblade, daughter of the ancient bloodline, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife and queen of these territories? It was not the private proposal on the tower. It was public formal, witnessed by the court and council. But Lyra did not hesitate. Yes, she said clearly, I will. The hall erupted in cheers, and Ravencroft, standing at the edge of the crowd, raised his cup in a small private salute. He had been wrong about many things, but he was learning. The wedding was held on the summer solstice. The great hall was transformed. White candles in silver holders, hundreds of them, making the stone space feel like a cathedral of light. The floor was covered with white and silver flowers that Aldrich had identified from the Guardian records. The entire kingdom came. Nobles and commoners alike filled the hall and spilled out onto the castle grounds. Lyra walked down the aisle in white, the Moonblade at her hip, her white hair unbound and falling around her shoulders like a river of moonlight. Garrett waited for her at the hall's center, and when she reached him, his hands came up to cup her face with a tenderness that made half the hall weep. The vows were spoken, the old words and the new. When the ceremony reached the moment for personal vows, Garrett spoke first, his voice low but carrying through the silent hall. Years ago, you told me you cleaned floors, and I told you that didn't change what was in your blood. He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. Today, I tell you that you are the most magnificent person I have ever known, and I am honored beyond measure to stand beside you. Lyra's eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was steady. And I tell you that I was just a girl cleaning floors when you saw me, truly saw me. You gave me a sword, a purpose, and a home. Today I give you my hand, my heart, and my future. And when Garrett was given permission to kiss his bride, he did so with the unhurried intention of a man who has everything he wants and refuses to be rushed. The Moonblade pulsed once warm and approving. 4 months after the summer solstice wedding, on a crisp autumn evening, when the leaves were turning gold outside their window, Lyra told Garrett she was pregnant. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Joy and terror mixed together in equal measure. My mother died in childbirth, he said quietly that night, holding her close. I'm terrified of losing you. Guardian blood is strong, Lyra said, bringing his hand to rest over her heart. I'm not leaving you. We're going to be terrible at this sometimes and extraordinary at it sometimes, and we're going to learn together. He pressed his forehead to hers, his most private gesture. Promise me, he whispered. I promise. Seraphina was born in late spring after a labor that was difficult but not dangerous. She came into the world with pale gold hair that curled softly against her head and gray eyes that held flecks of silver when the light caught them right. Garrett cried when he held her for the first time. Actually cried, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, he said to Lyra, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you for not leaving me. She's ours, Lyra said softly. She's absolutely ours. The 6 months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Lyra established the Guardian Council, a formal body that advised the crown on matters of justice and truth. For the first time in the kingdom's history, 3 Omega representatives were given council seats. The merit trials law was passed, allowing anyone regardless of rank to challenge for positions of authority. 5 former servants passed the trials and were promoted to positions in the guard and administration. A school was opened for low-ranked children. 200 students enrolled in the first month, including 47 Omegas who had never had access to education before. The reforms spread through the kingdom like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. And through it all, Seraphina grew. At 6 months old, during her naming ceremony, something extraordinary happened. Lyra was holding her, walking through the ceremony with the Moonblade at her hip as tradition required. Seraphina reached out with one tiny hand and grabbed the hilt. The blade pulsed, not a full awakening, but a recognition, a greeting. The hall gasped collectively. Lyra looked down at her daughter, at those gray-silver eyes that were watching the glowing sword with absolute fascination. The bloodline continues, Lyra said to the assembled crowd. The covenant is kept. 7 years later, Lyra found her daughter in the archives with Master Aldrich. Seraphina was bent over an ancient text, her pale gold hair falling across her face, her expression one of complete concentration. Master Aldrich, she said without looking up. I want to learn everything about the Guardians. Aldrich, now 72 and even more delighted with life than before, peered at her over his spectacles. That's very ambitious, young one. I know, Seraphina said seriously. Grandmother's blood is in me. Let's start. Aldrich sent a note to Lyra that evening. She's going to be extraordinary. Be warned, she already has the memory. Lyra showed the note to Garrett that night as they stood on the East Tower platform, watching the mountains fade into twilight. She's going to change the world, Garrett said. She already is, Lyra replied. Just like her father did, just like her mother is doing. They stood together in the fading light, and below them, the castle glowed warm with lamplight, and beyond that, the kingdom stretched peaceful and prosperous. And in the royal chambers, the moonblade hung on the wall, its steady silver glow, keeping watch over 3 generations. The covenant kept, the bloodline secure, the kingdom transformed. Lyra thought of her mother's rhyme, the one that had started all of this. Those who carry the moon in their blood need not fear the dark, for the dark was made to show them the way home. She had found her way home, and she had brought light with her.